Trump on the campaign trail has keeps accusing the Democrats of wanting to turn the United States into Venezuela. But his policies really are inspired by Juan Perón's Argentina. High tariffs, massive borrowing. The United States is going to run $1 trillion deficit in the coming fiscal year, a bigger deficit than George H.W. Bush ran to win the first Gulf War, and a bigger deficit than George W. Bush ran to fight the second Gulf War. And all of this is coming to a head, and the financial markets are telling us this.
Then I ask you again, does he understand economics?
Look, we're trying to get,
economics?
Does he understand economics? I don't. Look, the president,
And over this past holiday weekend, President Trump told wealthy supporters at Mar-a-Lago, you all just got a lot richer.
And the claims here that you'd see an increase of $4,000 to $9,000 in the typical family's income from a corporate tax cut are just outside the range of what the economics profession believes.
The size of the tax cut was about, according to CBO, was about $165 billion. The deficit increased by $113 billion. Do the arithmetic.
We should operate broadly on a pay-go basis. That is, if we want to do new things, we should figure out how to pay for them with higher taxes. And there's plenty of room to do that by adjusting aspects of the Trump tax cut that has done zero. I mean, heck, business only wanted the rate cut to 25%, and it was cut more than business was originally asking for, down to 21%, and that's brought a lot of stock buybacks. That's brought some increase in dividends. There is no evidence of any kind that it has brought any increases in investment or employment of any significance.
Talking about the growth that will come from tax cuts, and maybe that will materialize in more dramatic fashion. Maybe we've just gotten used to it. He certainly made a bigger case when he was running for president, ignores it as president. What did you make of that?
I think it's incredibly disappointing because it proves that he is indeed a politician. And I hate to say that because I'm rooting for the economy. But as far as the president and the deficit, there's no difference up there between Republicans and Democrats. If you take $1 trillion out of this economy and government spending, you're going to hurt it significantly. And whoever is the politician in charge at that point is probably not going to get reelected. That's why nobody does it. And it's disappointing to see that none of these guys have a vision for 20 years out. It's only a vision for the next election cycle, which is all of these politicians. There's no fiscal responsibility in D.C.
Trump in the campaign in 2016 made it clear he was not going to cut Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid, and he has stood firm by that.
Finally, had he done that, he probably would not have been elected.
Right, but and also we wouldn't be facing some of these challenges, this big number. And finally, the real tragedy of the numbers, we're not looking at a number like this and saying, wow, we've invested heavily in new infrastructure, in new schools, in new broadband, so we're going to see a payoff over the next 10, 15 years.
You have an entire caucus of conservatives, the Freedom Caucus, who have led with this issue in the past. But they were the ones who ended up voting and passing some of these larger spending bills.
Donald Trump is going to have to answer these questions at some point, but he will not have Republicans raising it. He'll have Democrats who will have a harder time if it's one of our liberals who are wanting to grow this thing even more.
This is how he'll answer it. He'll say, listen, Congress didn't cut the budget enough. And I'll be honest.
He did not have lots of cuts to go.
Well, he's going to say he did,
but he didn't.
Mick Mulvaney.
You got to be very careful about this, Charlie, because persuasion versus the facts here, and the facts are that he let it all happen. Now, the last president to effectively deal with this, not entirely on his own, but you got to give him credit, was Bill Clinton, working hand in hand with Newt Gingrich. I don't see any of that today.
You want to go after China? IP is your issue. There are bad trade practices. This isn't one of them. Aluminum is a fight in the past. China will take this and keep laughing. By yesterday afternoon, when President Trump saw the market go down, he was surprised. He was joined in the Oval Office by some of those executives. And General Kelly, who you rarely see defend those New Yorkers in the White House, told the president, Mr. President, these guys have told you hundreds of times this would be the market reaction. The president acted surprised. I'm not quite sure why.
That is exactly why they supported him, because when they see him crashing around among these global elites, they want it blown up, and he's smart enough to remember that. And if he starts following Gary Cohn around, he is not the guy who won the presidency.
It's very clear. I'm not an advocate of tariffs, and I'm not an advocate of trade wars. So
is that why you left the White House?
And impose tariffs on countries that take advantage of the United States. They've been taking advantage of us for years and years, and I've already done it in certain cases.
If you look at the numbers alone, it is very difficult to make the argument that the US is winning. US exports to China slumped $33 billion or 21%. Chinese exports to the US, by contrast, actually grew a little, rising 1% or $4 billion. In July, according to numbers just announced, China's surplus with the US grew still further. And over the first 7 months of the year, China's total surplus was worth a hefty $168 billion. This is exactly the outcome that Mr. Trump was determined to avoid when Washington imposed a flurry of tariffs against China last year. And the relative lack of pain being felt by China could also go some way to explaining why Beijing seems fairly nonchalant when it comes to negotiations with the US.
I think in some ways it's better to wait till after the election with China. But I'm not going to say that. I just think that.
I think the trade war with the United States was a very convenient excuse for the Chinese to slow down their economy when they needed to slow down an overheated economy where prices and real estate prices and everything were getting out of hand. And I think President Trump provided that excuse for the Chinese.
All of the problems that led to the 2008 financial crisis have gotten so much bigger. We have a lot more debt now than we did then. We made far more mistakes because interest rates were even lower for an even longer period of time. And now you throw what's happened since COVID-19 into the mix, where money printing is off the charts. QE, 4 is already bigger than 1, 2, and 3 combined, where you have the Federal Reserve right now printing more than 60 cents out of every dollar the federal government is spending. I mean, this is unprecedented that we're printing more money than we're collecting in taxes.
Bob, you brought up something really important, and it connects to the news of the moment. Whether this administration is overreaching and damaging the future of the dollar's reserve currency status. It's been a huge conversation, particularly in the last month, because we've had a bit of dollar weakness. Bob, do you think there is a threat of that, a risk of that playing out at the moment?
When you look at the weaponization of the dollar, when you look at how the United States is fighting the virus by, massive fiscal borrowing and printing and monetization in relation to other current countries which have fought it through science and, distancing and so forth, without printing money and without massive fiscal stimulation. In the near term, that's been a very positive for the U.S. economy relative to those others because you're injecting tons of adrenaline into the system to keep it going. And it's the differentiation of assets and including the differentiation of country outcomes and exchange rates that'll be the dominant feature of this environment.
We're in a new paradigm. Quite often you have a period of great prosperity like the 1920s, and it gets overextended with debt because everybody bets on the past being continued. It creates a bubble. 1929 is that when you have an economic downturn, that's a serious economic downturn, and less effective monetary policies at that same time, and you have a large wealth and values gap and political gaps. So if you think about that and you say American printing of money and the borrowing will leave us with a lot of debt and monetization, that's something interesting to talk about. And we need to talk about that. The internal politics is how do you deal with the wealth gap? How do you deal with the values gap? Do you have a common mission? Do we have an American dream that we can agree on and that we're pursuing that together? That's what revolutions are in their various ways. And there's always a revolution in one of these. Sometimes those are peaceful revolutions and sometimes they're disruptive. But it's a wealth shift that needs to take place. The Roosevelt shifted policies and changed taxes and so on in that way. And then in other countries, turning over democracy. Hitler came to power because of that gap. So how people deal with each other internally. There are always stress tests, these big stress tests that come along once every 75 years. There's enough wealth to go around. But what do you do when you're outside the ring of support?
By declining to commit to a peaceful transfer of power, President Trump has agitated many who fear he will refuse to leave office even if he loses the November election and may even resort to violence.
The ballots will be stolen. It's going to be fraudulent. It's going to be fraud all over the place. I guess at a certain point it goes to Congress. You know, at a certain point it goes to Congress. You know that.
But the terrifying reality is that there are also mechanisms that are legal and constitutional that could enable Trump to stay in office without actually winning the vote. It's possible congressional Republicans could decide that disputed states should simply not be counted. Suppose in this scenario, Michigan's votes are invalidated. That would ensure that neither candidate would get to 270 electoral votes. At that point, the Constitution clearly directs that the House of Representatives vote to determine the presidential election. But it does so with each state casting a single ballot. If the current numbers hold, there would be 26 state delegations that are Republican and 23 Democratic, with one tied. So the outcome would be to re-elect Donald Trump.
We have an advantage if we go back to Congress. Does everyone understand that? I think it's 26 to 22 or something because it's counted one vote per state.
Trump clearly understands this chain of events. He's been casting doubt on mail-in ballots for months, insisting that the results must be the ones that reflect the tally on election night. He said this week that without mail-in ballots, there would be no worries about a transfer of power because there would simply be a continuation of his rule. Because of a vague and creaky constitutional process and ferocious partisanship, this November, we might put on a display of democratic dysfunction that would rival any banana republic on the planet.
In this idea about the election, he's predicting and almost wishing for a quadruple train wreck on November 3rd.
It's a gift to our adversaries, right, who want to shake our confidence in who we are, shake our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions.
Steve, your explanation is somewhat different from the president because you're saying, well, the president didn't really know it was the fog of war. But when he has described it, he said he didn't want to panic the country. He didn't want to jump up and down and panic the country. Oh. And one of the reasons that there's a question about that is because of the fact that the president plays the panic card all the time, especially when he's talking about Joe Biden. Take a look.
If Biden wins, the mob wins. If Biden wins, the rioters, anarchists, arsonists, and flag burners win.
Peacefully protest. Peacefully protest.
Is that a president who is trying to keep the country calm?
What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine.
The worst case scenario could be a situation in which we don't have a clear winner of the elections, and we don't have a clear process for getting at the winner of that election.
Because of a vague and creaky constitutional process and ferocious partisanship, this November, we might put on a display of democratic dysfunction that would rival any banana republic on the planet.
It's the chant every president running for a second term wants to hear.
If you want to really drive him crazy, you say 12 more years.
You surely heard that, right? I mean, it's well known in the intelligence community that they're arming the Taliban, Russia.
I don't know. When you say arming, is
supplying
the Taliban
weapons.
Paying, or they?
Russia is supplying weapons and money to the Taliban.
I have heard that, but it's never. It's never reached my desk.
I mean, he said it on the record when he.
President Trump understands that President Putin does not like to be insulted. Putin takes it very personally. He harbors a grudge. He doesn't forget. And he will find some way of getting some degree of revenge as a result of that.
And I think the intelligence community has assessed this publicly primarily to denigrate Vice President Biden.
It's also a tactic that the President Trump has employed with other world leaders as well.
Bedenken Sie, nichts ist selbstverständlich. Unsere individuellen Freiheiten sind nicht selbstverständlich. Demokratie ist nicht selbstverständlich.
Always remember, they are coming after me because I am fighting for you. That's what's happening.
That's what revolutions are in their various ways. And there's always a revolution in one of these. Sometimes those are peaceful revolutions, and so sometimes they're disruptive. But it's a wealth shift that needs to take place. The Roosevelt shifted policies and changed taxes and so on in that way. And then in other countries, turning over democracy. Hitler came to power because of that gap. There's enough wealth to go around. But what do you do when you're outside the ring of support?
We're arguing about to whom does the future belong, because it's possible to be right and still to lose. But the future belongs to my side of the argument, because the future only belongs to those who care about it. The future does not belong to those who immolate the future in order to achieve a temporary advantage. That is the policy of the Trump administration, and that's what all of these high inflation, high tariff parties across Europe are. They don't know what they want to do, they only know who they hate. And hate doesn't build.